Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Cardinal Dash. I'm Daniel Martinez-Krams, joined, as always, by King Jemison. Couldn't be more happy to have him here with me this week as we get ever so much closer to real football. And the big development in this past week has been tackling at practice. Yes, crazy. In the era of social distancing, we have tackling. So in that spirit, we wanted to tackle all the issues facing Stanford this week. And I want to start off with some reporting from USA Today. David Shaw makes $4.8 million a year, according to that publication. Second longest tenured Pac12 coach. King, is David Shaw worth the money?
Absolutely not, Daniel. And it's great to be here. Thanks for the great introduction. But I'm just going to tell you this right now. David Shaw is not a $4.8 million per year coach. And I would argue there's not a single college football coach in America that actually should get $4.8 million a year, maybe outside of Dabo Swinney and Nick Saban and a handful of others out there. But listen, if David Shaw is making $4.8 million per year, and this is after a pay cut that he took, and credit to him for taking that pay cut in the midst of COVID-19, that means Stanford paid over $1 million per victory last season. 4 victories, over $4 million at stake. I mean, that is crazy money, and it's a lot more than, if you're looking at Nick Saban, you're paying him $9 million. Well, if he goes out and wins the national championship, gets you 14 or 15 wins, a lot better ratio, a lot better bang for your buck. And obviously, that's not what you're looking for at Stanford. And what you're paying for with David Shaw is longevity. He is the longest tenured coach in the Pac-12. He's been around for a long time, has gotten a lot of other job offers, particularly from the NFL, and he's chosen to stay loyal to his alma mater. And I respect that. And I think he is a fantastic coach. He's been the best coach in program history. There's no doubt about that. But how can you cut 11 sports, citing a major shortfall in program finances, and yet still pay your coach more than any other team in the Pac-12? That is ludicrous. That is saying we don't care about our athletics program as a whole. We just care about our football program, and really we just care about the man running it. So we're going to pay him at all costs. And obviously, the $4.8 million a year he makes wouldn't solve all the problems they have financially, but it certainly would do a whole heck of a lot of good. And maybe you're able to save some of those sports that ended up losing their program status.
Yeah, exactly. It would be much better if he made Mario Cristobal a salary. Great Oregon coach, $2.5 million. But I do have to push back on a few things because I do think he's worth that much money just in terms of what the longevity that you mentioned, right? He's been a coach of the year, Dodd Trophy, 2 Rose Bowl wins in a decade, 3 trips. That's unprecedented for Stanford. So in some ways it does make sense. And I'm sure he's bringing in at least that much to the program. And that's where it really gets confusing for me. And I don't necessarily know what to think here because he's probably bringing in that much, but so is all of the entire team, all 85 on the roster, plus all the walk-ons. They're bringing in that money. And obviously we've had this conversation before. I think we both think that the athletes should be able to at least benefit from their name, image, and likeness. But on top of that, it's worrying for me, the economics of it all. And I went back to this the other week. Stanford had 2 professors win a Nobel Prize in economics, right? And they're not making anywhere near David Shaw's salary. Stanford has tons of faculty that are winning Nobel Prizes, MacArthur Genius Grants, and they're not making that salary, right? That's what's worrying to me because why is David Shaw, and I don't think anyone on Stanford campus is making as much as he is. And that's where it gets confusing for me because he probably is the most famous face of Stanford right now. I don't think MTL, the president, has that face. So yes, he is a public figure, but why is he bringing in $4.8 million? And as you just mentioned, they cut 11 sports. And I think it brings us back to this fact that Stanford is really moving to a much different athletic model than we thought in the past. They're moving to that football powerhouse, to that basketball powerhouse. They're not trying to say, we have all of these sports. We have 36 sports. We're going to beat you at all of them. We care about the Olympic sports. They're definitely here. These are the ones that make money. That's what we're going to go with.
And listen, I get it. In college football, you have to pay for wins. It is an expensive sport because it is a major revenue sport. It's a sport that makes a whole lot of money, and it's a sport that dishes out a whole lot of money to the people involved. And since you don't have to pay the players, you pay the coaches even more than they would make otherwise. But the reason you do that is for competitive advantage. And competitive advantage is not a relevant excuse when you're coaching, when you're paying your coach more than anyone else in the Pac-12, but you haven't won the conference since 2015. And frankly, other than 2017 where they made the Pac-12 title game, but really weren't a fantastic team, arguably not a top 15 team. They haven't been that close in the years since that magical 2015 season. First half of the 2010s, obviously David Shaw earned his salary. But in the second half of the 2010s, I don't know if you're seeing that kind of production, the kind of production you expect for nearly $5 million a year. And this, by the way, after, like I said, he took a pay cut. The Stanford Daily did some reporting in 2017 that estimated his salary at nearly $6 million based on Stanford's tax returns. And I don't know if that was the amount of the pay cut he took. That would be a sizable pay cut. But regardless, his salary has come down in recent years, and yet it's still entirely too high when you compare it to the rest of the Pac-12. If we were in the SEC, $4.8 million is chump change. But we're in the Pac-12, and programs that are in a much better place right now are not paying their coach nearly as much as Stanford. And this at a point where every athletic department is hurting, but Stanford has made it clear they're hurting more than most, and it is really being passed on to the athletes rather than the coaches, which is where I have an issue.
Yeah, absolutely there. And I think, honestly, that 6 million number seems right, because I think they reported that the coaches took a pay cut of 20%, which would put him exactly at 4.8 million. So honestly, yeah, that's exactly right in line. And what surprises me is that Stanford is setting the price point for the Pac-12, right? 18th in FBS for David Shaw, that seems about right. He's had consistently top 20 teams. I'm not too upset with that, right? But setting the price point in the Pac-12 when we know how much less the Pac-12 makes, it just doesn't really make sense for me for Stanford to say, we care more about paying our head football coach than any other school in the Pac-12, when clearly that's not aligned with the priorities of the students, of the faculty, of the president. John Hennessy, the past president, said multiple times he would like a 500 team each year. I don't see MTL as being any more gung-ho about football either. So it's really confusing to me that Stanford as an institution is saying football is our priority, and that's exactly what they're doing with David Shaw being at the top of the list. Not saying that he doesn't deserve that. I'm sure he does, and I'm sure he does so much for so many people. But it does surprise me that he is leading the way in the Pac-12.
Absolutely, and that doesn't make any sense when you look at the amount of revenue that other Pac-12 schools are making. Stanford's data is harder to get because they're a private school and don't have to release as much, but suffice it to say that Oregon, USC, Washington, and Utah and a number of other Pac-12 schools are making a lot more on football than Stanford. I mean, just look at Stanford Stadium on any given Saturday. It is not nearly as full, and people are not paying as much for those seats because, you don't have the demand. And so when you look at the fact that they're not bringing the most revenue, they're not winning the conference title as much as they were earlier in the decade, the setting the price point for the Pac-12, as you said, is a bit steep, and I cannot justify that. And on the other side of things, I think it is so surprising because it is clearly not an institutional priority. Athletics are clearly not an institutional priority. So it's confusing to me that David Shaw has become such a must-have for all of Stanford. Stanford University has invested deeply in this man, and I think he's worth it. He is a fantastic person and a great coach, but it must be that he went out in the NFL and was able to show Stanford the amount that he could be making, and so they were forced to up his salary to compete. And you know what? Kudos to him. That's what you're supposed to do. Everybody's got to maximize their personal finances, but I think that that's the only explanation for where Stanford is at right now in terms of paying their coaches. And it'd be interesting to see what Stanford's coordinators are making, because I imagine that they are not making a salary that's comparable with the top of the Pac-12. I think Stanford is prioritizing head coaching over assistant coaching as well. It is a one-man army, and David Shaw is not going anywhere, folks. I don't think his stock is as high in the NFL as it was, so he's going to be on the farm for a long time to come.
Yeah, I think it's well known that he has lifetime job security, which I think he's earned, right, as a Stanford alum, and then all that he's produced on the field. But yeah, definitely Stanford paying a steep price to keep his services moving forward. And with that, I want to go on to what we kind of teased a little bit earlier, tackling, right? It's been a big talk in a lot of the press conferences as the reporters want to say, how's it going? Because as everyone's seen around the country, tackling is an issue this year. So King, I pose to you the question, is tackling going to be an issue for Stanford in 2020?
college football this year, you've seen tackling be a massive issue. And I mean, you're seeing overs hitting all over the place. You're seeing some ridiculous scores. Memphis UCF was 50-49. Ole Miss Alabama was 63-48. These are some crazy games. And I think Stanford is going to be hurt by this more than most because, first of all, they're having less time to tackle. They just started tackling this past week. I mean, we are less than 3 weeks out from game day, which, whoo, go Card. But at the same time, they're really shortening the timeline. And tackling was an issue for the Cardinal last year. Think about how much trouble Stanford has had in recent years getting dual-threat QBs to the ground. The Cardinal defensive line made Ian Book look like Lamar Jackson. Not so much throwing the ball, but definitely running the ball. I mean, he was able to escape numerous times. I think of Jake Browning, another not very athletic guy who was able to frequently escape the pocket because Stanford's pass rushers couldn't get into the ground. And if you think about Stanford's biggest issues defensively in big games in recent years, it has been looking very unathletic compared to their opponents. And that comes through in tackling. If you look at the UCF game, if you look at the USC game last year, if you look at the Notre Dame games recently, and it's to a certain extent the Oregon and Washington games, there are better athletes on the other side, and Stanford's secondary and linebackers are struggling to get guys on the ground. And I see that continuing. Well, I'll talk about it later. There's some guys I think could kind of fill that void. But tackling was an issue last year. It's going to be a bigger issue this year. And I think the biggest concern for me when we talked about recruiting recently is that Stanford looks progressively less and less athletic compared to their peers. And that is something that they've got to remedy. They've got to get that elite talent on the back end, and particularly in the front seven.
I mean, you just listed off a whole lot of big games. What about the big game last year when Chase Garbers beat them on the ground? That's one to me. It's just like missed tackling. That's really what it comes down to. And the one thing that gives me hope is that their Oregon game last year was actually one of their better graded tackling games. PFF had the defensive line's run defense at an 80.8 and tackling at 83.7. One of the better performances of that group, actually. But other than that, has to be very worrisome. And David Shaw talked this past week about like 3 levels of tackling, he called it. One was like basically a high school level where you're pretty inconsistent. You're not going to tackle consistently. The other is professional level where you could maybe take 9 months off because of COVID, not tackle anyone, come right out, first day of practice, hit everyone hard, you're secure. And then there's where most of Stanford players are and where most collegiate players are, which is they know it, they can tell you exactly what needs to be done, how to square up, but they can't always execute. And that's where I think a lot of Stanford players are right now. What has me worried and also hopeful is that they had all of those Zoom meetings. They've all had all of those classroom sessions to say, this is how we tackle. Now it's how well can they translate that onto the field. It's not dummies anymore. They're going against real guys real soon, and we're going to find out. I don't know what the answer is going to look like. We'll talk about that later, that no one really has seen what they look like. But that is kind of where we're at right now, where it's up in the air. It's what were these guys doing in the offseason? Can they put what they learned in the classroom into practice? Can they take what they learned in lecture into the lab?
Daniel, I hate to tell you, watching Zoom meetings does not help you tackle a man on the football field. Those two things are worlds apart, I got to say. I was just on a webinar with Stanford women's volleyball head coach Kevin Hambley. And I asked him, is there any advantage to the virtual format? Is there anything that you've liked that you want to take forward? He's like, nothing. Face-to-face interaction is the key. And even more so, actually participating in the sport you're going to play is the key. So yes, Zoom meetings allow these teams to build chemistry, and I think that's the most important thing that you could do in that offseason. I think Stanford football does have good chemistry. I think they are a brotherhood. They believe that they're going to come out and have a great season. But in terms of execution, it's just like you said. You can know exactly what to do to tackle any player, be from Derrick Henry to a high school freshman. But it's not the same as going out there and doing it. And I think it's particularly hard when you get in that full speed situation and all of a sudden you've got to think about, all right, what defense are we in? What is the offense doing? What is this formation telling me? And then somebody is running at you full speed with a blocker and you got to get him to the ground. I think that has been a major concern. And I think it really highlights the concern that I've seen otherwise with Stanford's pass rush, that frankly, they're not getting guys to the ground frequently enough. And that is where Stanford's defense, I think, will either be, that's where it will live and die. because I think the secondary, there's questions, but we know it'll hold up okay. Dwayne Akina has earned that respect. Linebackers, I'm worried, but I think Curtis Robinson's going to anchor that group. But the defensive line, I just don't know what to expect. Thomas Booker is a very talented player. Dalen Wade-Perry is a talented player. Gabe Reed's shown a lot. Tomas Schaffer is a project, but I think potentially a productive project. And there's other guys there that should flash, like Andres Fox. I mean, but when I look at it, I don't see anybody who's been there before, who's proven that they're going to get in the backfield and put a quarterback on his butt. And I think that has to do with tackling. It also has to do with talent and being able to beat college-level offensive linemen. And I think that, like I said, that is where Stanford's defense is going to make or break its season in 2020.
Yeah, the one thing I want to touch on from that is you mentioned that all of those other things that go on, you're asking yourself what defense we are in before you tackle. I think Stanford has made a concerted effort to pare that down. They've made simpler defenses. They've gone back. They looked at film. They figured out what worked. They threw out what didn't. So I think they have talked about paring down that defense. Kendall Williamson talked about it. They said David Shaw talked about it. Lance Anderson's talked about it. We're going to make it smaller. We're going to make sure everyone knows what's going on. And we're going to play fast. So I do think that will help. But I'm totally with you. I think Thomas Booker you have to look to on the defensive line. And then after that, questions. And we're really going to find out what a lot of guys are made of. In addition to Curtis Robinson, I'm really excited for Ricky Miezon and Jacob Mangum-Farrar. Two guys who are both really hard hitters, have just coming back from injury. And then also Kendall Williamson, who Simi Fehoko last week talked about as the hardest hitter and the most sure hitter in terms of tackling. So all of those guys, I think, are going to really make or break the season, as you're talking about. But as you're saying, Stanford not in a good position in a year when every team is in a bad position with tackling, and really going to be worried about what we're going to see week one and beyond that. Because if Stanford is once again facing tackling as an issue, as they had last year and the year before that, in for a very tough season. And sadly, my 5-1 prediction, I don't think is going to hold up.
Listen, let's throw some positivity because we're just really throwing some fuel on the negativity fire, which we don't need in 2020. But I do think there is, just like you said, a lot of potential talent on this defense. And Stanford, as we know, is a disciplined team, a well-coached defensive team. Lance Anderson has been there for a long time. He has been running this defense extremely well. We talk about his halftime adjustments. We talk about his ability to just completely fool quarterbacks, particularly in the second half of games. But I think he's also a great teacher of fundamentals. Dwayne Akina is a great teacher of fundamentals. The rest of this defensive coaching staff, they are able to get guys coached up to do as best as their talent can net them. And I think, we don't have a Paulson Adebo this year. You don't have a Solomon Thomas or even a Harrison Phillips, but you have some talented guys who maybe can grow into that. And I think, to me, it's all about, can you get a difference maker at each level of defense? And if I'm looking at a difference maker on the defensive line, I'm looking at Thomas Booker. I think he has that potential if he can play up to, particularly just what he looks like. I mean, that man is scary and absolutely jacked. And I think a guy who has the body to be an NFL talent and the mind as well, a very smart football player. And then at the linebacker position, Curtis Robinson is the established guy, but can one of those guys you mentioned, Ricky Miezon or Jacob Mangum-Farrar, turn into a star at linebacker, a sideline-to-sideline guy? And in the back end, can you get a guy like, I don't know, Caillou Blue Kelly, Jonathan McGill, or just like you mentioned, Kendall Williamson, to become an elite, don't throw at that guy kind of secondary player? Then you're looking at a much better situation for the Stanford defense.
With you all along there, King, and it's just mind-boggling, right? That there's so much variability from what Stanford was as a defense to where they are now. And it's worrying, and I get to what you're talking about a few weeks ago with recruiting, where they're not recruiting the same athletic guys, and I think that's showing. But to another point that I made, that the coaching staff is usually able to make the most of it, that Stanford can under-recruit at times, but then have such good development and have people who are so able to learn because they are Stanford student athletes, that they're able to pick up on all of these things. And however much Zoom sessions don't help, eventually when they're seeing the field, even if it's at Woodside High School, basically I'm saying I hope they don't play like high school players when they step out on a college field this year. So with all of that, we're having to do all of this speculating on what the team will actually look like because practices are so far closed to the media. And honestly makes a lot of sense with COVID issues, but also seems like it could be worked out. So King, I want to ask, should practices as they are now in most of the Pac-12 schools remain closed to the media?
From a health perspective, perhaps, but I think you could do this in a safe and healthy manner. I think you can do it with social distancing. I mean, you look at Stanford practices, they're not very crowded. Sometimes it's you, me, and 2 or 3 other guys, and that's it in the huddle around David Shaw. You could do that with more spacing. Obviously, everyone wears masks. And obviously, maybe you limit availability on any given day. You have to apply for a credential to go to practice. That's an obvious change you could make. But it seems to me like they're taking advantage of the chance to limit information on the program, which frankly is based on what I've seen from David Shaw and his coaching staff. That's something they like to do. They do not want to be forthcoming with the media or the public, and I understand that. They are trying to run a program. They don't need outside noise. But I've always thought if David Shaw was in the SEC, he would despise it. He would hate it every second and leave immediately because he does not like that kind of scrutiny on his program. Not so much that he can't take it personally. He's got thick skin, but he does not like all the questions. He does not like all the media hoopla. And so I think that this was a good chance for, not saying he's taking advantage of COVID, but it was a good chance for him to orchestrate the kind of media relations he would like to. And obviously the Pac-12 made that decision for him. So my guess is that media could cover practices safely. And so I wish that we were able to do that because more than ever, we need media on the ground to not only, see how these teams are doing, but more importantly, see how these coaches are treating the situation. See if they are maintaining a safe and healthy environment for their players. If you don't have outside eyes peering into your program, then the only thing we're getting is the test results, if those are even released. And so those might tell a bad story, but there could be a lot more going on underneath the surface that you really can't tell unless you have media getting into practice and getting close to the program.
You went a lot there, King, and I have to say I agree with all of it. Hard to say on this show, I know, but yeah, no, the Pac-12 also just needs eyes in general, right? Coverage breeds coverage, and the Pac-12 is hurting for viewership. Why wouldn't they have people telling these stories? And I think Ken Rosenthal about baseball talked about it in the spring. With you want the reporters in the locker room telling these stories because that's what gets people coming back to baseball. Same thing with football. If we're able to tell the stories of these players, then the fans are going to get attached to them. Then they're going to be watching. The Pac-12 network is hurting for so long. The Pac-12 hasn't had viewers. Stanford hasn't had viewers. Why wouldn't you want your media there? And the Zoom press conferences are fine. That's okay. I fully support being able to raise my hand on Zoom and have Scott and Tyler help me out there. Scott and Tyler, if you're listening, I love you. You're the best SIDs in the conference, without a doubt. But why can't we be there with binoculars at a distance, seeing how the tackling is going, seeing, as you mentioned, if the protocols are being followed? Because that's why we have media. We have that fourth estate to keep checks and balances on all these things. And I totally understand them wanting to keep things separate. But David Shaw, and you mentioned this, has that thick skin, but also will readily make jokes. In the first press conference, he definitely made a comment to RJ about that article he wrote, accusing them of all the Miller Law stuff. So he will engage with the media, and I agree that he's probably taken this opportunity to take a little bit of pressure off the program after a 4-8 season, right, where people are upset, maybe want to talk to him and a little bit more. But I personally think having media at your practices is a good thing. Pete Carroll famously had an open practice in Los Angeles for a long time. Anyone could be there. I understand not having fans there. That makes sense. But having limited media and able to cover your team better to get you more viewership to help your team in the future seems like a no-brainer to me.
This is something that's happening around the country. I mean, if you listen to, SEC beat reporters, they're also saying that, yes, they might get some access to practice, but not nearly as much as they usually would. They would usually be inside the team building all the time. Now they're never getting inside the team building and rarely getting a chance to go to practice. But you're exactly right. More than ever, we need media scrutiny of all levels of society, and we need media to tell great stories that humanize athletes and coaches. And that's something that I had a great class with Gary Pomerantz, a sports writing legend. And one of the things we talked about a lot is how access to players and coaches has decreased dramatically over the last few decades. And that's leading to less, illustrious reporting than we've seen in the past. You simply cannot paint a picture of an athlete nearly as well if you're not able to actually be around that athlete on a daily basis and see how they operate beyond just when they've got their public relations, their PR face on, because everybody has a different persona when they get in front of the camera, when they know they're in front of the camera. That's what made a documentary like The Last Dance so special, is that it peeled back the curtain and you could see what these guys, MJ and many others on the legendary 90s Bulls, were like when those cameras were turned off, except for the cameras that were allowed to be there. And so that is something that we're missing this year. And I think it's something that the Pac-12 is just a difference between most Pac-12 schools and the rest of the country in general, is that there's less media coverage. So you kind of have to do the bare minimum. You got to write your game recaps. You got to write your previews. You got to, do the occasional feature story or rundown, but you can't do the same level of in-depth reporting, because think about RJ. He's a staff of one. Think about Jacob. He's a staff of one. And shout out to both of those guys, and big shout out to Tyler and Scott and all of the Stanford communications department, because they are wonderful. But like I said, one-man band can't do nearly as much as, a dedicated team of reporters. And, the Pac-12 got a lot of negative PR to cover up. And we'll hope they can do it on the field, but at the very least, it would have been helpful if they could do it in the papers as well.
Absolutely. You get content by having better content. That's how you get the people to come and participate in your product, to buy your gear, to watch the games, to support the program, whatever it looks like. It's because all of these people ask, are you safe, humanized? And right now, the Pac-12 overall, and especially Stanford, is hurting for that. So they should absolutely do everything in their power to encourage people to be able to cover their program, because they're doing so many great things, right? They have Cardinal Black, which is a student athlete group that is making strides in the community. They should have someone who's able to highlight that effectively, right? All of these different things that you think they'd want to have people cover, it seems like we're not getting that same access. And yeah, like you said with The Last Dance, same thing with, if you think about the Boys of Summer, right? That baseball book where they were able to profile all those players on the Dodgers, the 50s, in so much depth, because the writer had, Roger Kahn, had built up all of those relationships. And exactly, that's what you need. You need relationships, because it shouldn't be a reporter coming in there twice a week, sticking their microphone into a player's face and saying, what do you think is going to happen next week? That's not helpful. That's not what fans want. That's not what anybody wants to read. What's helpful is having real access to real players, humanizing them, telling great stories. That's what people want. And again, really wish that it could happen this year. And then I don't want this year, even if it's COVID, to continue into the next years, if that makes sense. I don't want these more restrict protocols to be able to be allowed to continue, because I think it'll really hurt the content moving forward.
Absolutely right. And my impression is that it probably won't, but we just never know when things are going to get even close to back to normal. But an interesting side effect of this is, more so than ever, we have no idea what we're going to see in the first game of the season. And I think we saw some crazy results if you look back to the first weeks of football elsewhere. I mean, think about Mississippi State over LSU. We talked about that at length because of KJ Costello. Well, KJ just got benched in the past game, and his time as a starter may be done. But that was a result nobody could have seen coming. And now, looking at it a few weeks later, it looks even stranger. We don't know what's going to happen week one. We haven't seen the Stanford team on the field. We haven't seen their Oregon opponent on the field in a spring game scenario or in a media access practice scenario. So the first chance we get to see these guys is going to be on the field in Autzen Stadium on November 7th. I could not be more excited, could not be more nervous, but I do think that honestly bodes well for a team like Stanford, that they're a wild card this season. We just don't know. Other coaches don't know. And I think hopefully David Shaw and Tavita Pritchard and this offensive coaching staff have done some working in the lab to create a little bit more dynamic and different Stanford offense that highlights Davis Mills' strengths and the strengths of his wide receiver core. And maybe we're going to see a Stanford team that comes out with a really potent offense that, maybe not something that we would have gotten in the same way if we'd had media, if we had spring game, and if we'd known about it all along. So that's what I'm hoping for. That's the bright side, is that David Shaw is going to go out and throw. Davis Mills, under David Shaw's direction, is going to go out and throw for 500 yards in Austin on Saturday the 7th.
That would be great. Thank you all so much for watching this episode of Cardinal Dash. For King Jemison, I'm Daniel Martinez-Krams. Follow us at Dash Sports TV on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. and Instagram. Thank you all so much. Have a great night.